Hey everybody, it looks like we have a pretty light agenda this week. I know that Jonathan was going to have an agenda topic about moving the cluster registry to beta, so I suggest we wait maybe a minute or two for him to see if he shows up.
Okay.
Is that you, Jonathan?
Yes, that's me.
Hey. Okay. I think we can go ahead and get started. It looks like we have a kind of light attendee list today. The first thing on the agenda is that I have cut a new pull request for the SIG Multicluster charter. I was asked by Brandon Phillips to see if we could get this merged soon. It looks like from the steering committee that Tim St. Clair asked us to be more specific. I feel like that is difficult to do without being so specific that we include just a list of projects rather than a list of areas. I'm wondering what people think about this. I'm wondering if folks have had a chance to look at the pull request yet. Any thoughts about this? I've dumped it into the chat.
Yeah, Paul, I think keeping it minimal and putting it out there might be the first most sensible thing to do, and other changes can be incremental on top, given that minimal stuff is approved by the steering committee.
Okay. Anything else? All right. Sounds like we're done with that one. Go ahead, Jonathan. Cluster registry.
So I have the cluster registry cluster object has been sitting for quite a while. I think at this point it seems like it's at a point where I would like to start to move it to beta. I haven't the thing that I haven't gotten as much community feedback or much feedback from people about having used it. I think at this point it might just be necessary to move it to the next phase of the API development, and then hopefully more people, the announcement of it going beta and the fact that it is beta will convince more people to see it. I don't know. There was, I think, an issue that Ivan and I had discussed. I can't remember offhand what that was, if there was something in particular that we had discussed that would prevent us from moving it to beta today. Ivan, do you recall what that was?
If we're thinking of the same thing, it might be just some of the fields that may or may not be getting used by any users of the cluster registry, and whether it makes sense to actually support those, since if we move to beta, we will be obligated to support those moving forward.
That's right. I don't necessarily have a strong opinion on this. I think it's hard to. My worry is that if removing fields that we believe have value would make the object just less useful. And so people would find they need those fields anyway, and we would simply have to re-add them. But I don't know.
Just out of interest, I agree with you, Jonathan. Just out of interest, what fields are we talking about here?
I believe if I look at the spec, I think it was
like auth info, for example.
Yeah.
We haven't really, we had talked about using that, but we haven't really come up with any good constructions for using that yet. It doesn't mean that we won't. It's just that we should consider the implications of moving it to beta and keeping those fields in place.
I don't think that we should move a field without a clear use to beta. So maybe that means that if we don't think that there's a super clear use for this field, that we should take it out and we can reintroduce it at a future time if we have broad agreement that it's something that we should do.
Just out of curiosity, how do people use the cluster registry today if they don't have auth info?
So auth info is not a secret that you use to authenticate. It's supposed to be a statement about what type of auth the cluster expects. So in Federation, for example, we have another API resource called Federated Cluster that adds a reference to a secret that you use to authenticate to one of the clusters.
And would that be, I mean, it sort of seems weird if we have two cluster objects. It would superficially suggest that maybe those fields should have been in the cluster registry. I'm just, I don't know anything much about either of them, but it seems to motivate that we might be short of information in the cluster registry.
Yeah, I think that I am personally fine with there being two different resources. I have wondered to myself whether we ought to pull the resource that in Federation we call Federated Cluster into the cluster registry itself and call it something like cluster connection, because there's, and please folks familiar with Federation, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe there's anything specific to Federation about the Federated Cluster resource. It just adds a secret reference that contains the auth information. And it's something that anybody that wanted to use the cluster registry would likely have to add in their own projects. I don't think cluster necessarily ought to have a reference to auth information, because you could potentially have one cluster record and then two different auth credentials that people may independently want to use with it. So it doesn't seem like a huge problem to me that there are two different resources, but I have wondered whether we ought to pull it in to the cluster registry. And to just circle back to the original discussion topic of this thread, I am not certain whether anybody actually wants the auth info field in cluster registry. Is anybody actually using that, for example, on this call that can say what they're using it for?
I was actually, it sounds like there's no answers there. I was actually interested from the opposite direction, which is, if I'm using cluster registry, how do I know how to authenticate against the clusters I find in there?
Yeah, and right now, Quentin, there is no such notion actually in the cluster registry itself. And that's basically the federated cluster resource in Federation. And hence my thinking about, should this be something more general that, like, if you want to actually make a connection to a cluster and you want to store that information in an API resource somewhere, should that be part of cluster registry? That's the question I'm examining in my head.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think the issue that the cluster registry runs into in trying to express this idea of giving you information to authenticate to a cluster is that Kubernetes doesn't have a good machine readable way of giving that information. The landscape of authentication methods is so large and so potentially complex that there is no good representation of that programmatically that I can then point some library to. So it ends up becoming this, this general looking field that becomes very domain specific. oh, if you're running a multi-cluster set up by this company, well, then this is how these fields are used, and this is the info you have to know. Whereas if you're running this different multi-clusters, if you're running federation, then this is how you would use those fields. It's unfortunate that there's not a generalizable, generic way to express that, but that isn't really a problem that the cluster registry itself can necessarily fix unless Kubernetes has that, I think, for a cluster to be able to express that information.
But that gets back to my previous question. So let's assume that I want to use the cluster registry. So I use it and I get a list of my clusters. But I have to have credentials for those clusters somewhere else. And I need to know which ones to use for which clusters, which seems to imply that I need a different registry of cluster names and credentials, which seems contradictory to needing cluster registry in the first place. I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong, but how could I possibly use cluster registry without having another registry of clusters somewhere with the credentials in them?
Yeah, and that's my point too, Quentin. And in Federation, we introduced a resource called Federated Cluster, whose spec is exactly two fields. One of them is an object reference that points to the entry in the cluster registry.
Yeah.
The other one is a secret reference that points to a secret that holds a kube config. So Jonathan, in terms of finding the right way to express the authentication mechanisms that you would need, I would say at a bare minimum, the kube config seems like the lowest common denominator, since you can give a kube config to a client and have it produce a client according to that kube config.
That's fair.
And we could potentially, I guess, as we find different authentication methods that people want to use, we could look at adding like union type fields for those, or I mean, that's one option. I think though that it's a real thing that without something else to store the auth information, the cluster registry on its own only gets you about 50% there.
Yeah, that is true. Authentication info was one of the big hopes for it. It's also one of the unfortunately most difficult issues, because the Kubernetes, especially for people who don't trust the Kubernetes API layer to be a safe, secure store for clusters, it becomes extremely cumbersome to use the cluster registry to reference credentials.
But even if the credentials are stored somewhere other than in the cluster API, in the API, how would I even know which ones to use against which clusters?
I mean, essentially, the idea of the auth info was that it would provide enough information for you to figure that out, whether in a machine readable way or whether as a user looking at the object and realizing, hey, this is the file that I need to reference on a shared network.
Yeah, or I need to go to this key store somewhere and pull this key out and then use it or whatever. Yeah, I mean, that seems to make a lot of sense to me. And maybe one of those places is go into the cluster, go to the secret, and you'll find it there. And if people don't like using secrets in Kubernetes, then they can put it somewhere else. Was that your thinking?
Yeah, that was generally the thinking.
Okay.
That was the reasoning behind the original auth info. There was also the reasoning behind the move to have the auth info field as it stands today be two object references, one for credentials that a user would use or users would use to access, or a way to get credentials that users would use, but also a credential for controllers that wanted to access the cluster.
Yeah, makes sense. Just out of curiosity, this is a question to you, Paul, or anyone else who's familiar with the federated cluster resource. So right now it has a reference to the cluster registries cluster, right?
Yep.
And what exactly does it need to get out of the cluster registry for that?
It uses the, it gets the API endpoints from the cluster registry, and then the federated cluster has the reference to the secret that holds the auth, well, specifically it holds a kube config.
Okay, but right now it has a reference to the cluster registry cluster, and all it gets out of there is an API endpoint. So if it replaced its reference to the cluster registry with an API endpoint, then it wouldn't need the cluster registry.
Yeah, that's right. I think though that I think that would be the wrong thing to do, in the sense that I'd prefer to make the cluster registry generally useful. And
I agree. To be clear, I'm not motivating for doing that. I'm just trying to figure out, in its current form,
Gotcha.
the cluster registry provides something at the expense of a reference to a cluster registry cluster. It provides one thing, which is an API endpoint, and the cost benefit there is not clearly positive. So to make it positive, we would have to provide more useful stuff in the cluster registry, so that it didn't have to be done in the federated cluster, or ideally the federated cluster wasn't necessary at all.
Yeah, to me,
today that's not the case.
I think for me, ideally we would rename federated cluster to something like cluster connection and move it to the cluster registry.
Yeah, that sounds sane to me, because as you pointed out, it has absolutely nothing to do with federation.
Yeah, and auth info, to be really specific about it, I'm just going to dump the link into the chat here, is described as containing public information that can be used to authenticate to and authorize with this cluster. It is not meant to store private information like tokens or client certificates, and cluster registry implementations are not expected to provide hardened storage for secrets. We might want to get more specific about what that actually means. Reading it, I'm not sure that, without some history on the project, I'd be able to tell what auth info is supposed to be. It really seems like it's more metadata about the authentication mechanisms that the cluster might use more than anything else. But I'm not sure that that is what I would take away from this if I were reading it for the first time.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the original intent of this was never to store credentials as part of the cluster resource. It was always to have metadata, like you mentioned, and some sort of indication on where you could go get the actual auth info for the cluster that you're wanting to authenticate with.
Yeah, I mean, that seemed fairly clear from the description that Paul read a moment ago, to me anyway. I mean, that seemed obvious. It would, I would imagine, be useful to have a fallback place where you could put credentials that are not necessarily in the cluster registry per se, and certainly not part of the cluster resource, but in your Kubernetes cluster, like a reference to a secret.
Yeah, I think that's very much what I had in mind for moving federated cluster into the cluster registry.
I mean, it seems to me, until such time as you can actually use the cluster registry without building additional stuff to make it useful in any way, it may not be a good idea to move it to beta. That's a understandably controversial statement, but I'm just not sure that having a resource in beta that you can't use without building some other resources, which we think might move to the cluster registry in future. Yeah, I'm not sure it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the shape of auth info as it stands now is something that I think that we should move to beta.
Okay, that's reasonable. I suppose that means that we're going to have further discussion on this to try and move that field of that part of the object to a point where it is more generally useful.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would be very curious to know if anybody is actually using the auth info field. We're not using it in Federation. And so honestly, Jonathan, I was kind of hoping that you'd pipe up about that because I have the impression that the cluster registry is being used as part of GKE on-prem. At least like I think I could be excused for thinking that might be the case. And I wondered if that's something that Google has a use case around the auth info field for.
I mean, I think if Google is going to use it, the problem that Google would run into is the fact that the auth info field does not reference secure secret storage, which makes it very cumbersome for us to use it. At this point, I'm not quite up on what the precise plan is for how we plan to use that field in the cluster registry object. I know that it's not actively being used today. So yeah, that is why I didn't pipe up, because we were not actively using it.
Okay. In that case, I think that it would be a good idea to make a poll that removes it and see if anybody complains. Like in the sense that, not that we would merge this pull request, but like just making the pull request that removes that field could probably shake some folks that may be using it out.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. No, that is a good idea. That would help us see.
All right, I'll take the action item on that.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, I'm still struggling to understand how people would practically use the cluster registry for anything without having to build something which is pretty close to a cluster registry on top of it, like Federation has done. And I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm just saying it sounds like we need a bit more before it can be a useful thing. And it's moving in the right direction, but it doesn't seem like it's got to a point where it's a beta useful thing yet. And I'd be happy to be proven otherwise. I'm hoping someone's going to prove me otherwise, but I haven't heard it yet.
I would be happy to make a poll also that adds like a cluster connection resource that looks essentially the same as federated cluster and Federation today, and see if we can get some attention that way and get some kind of signal from folks that may be watching the project that yes, this is a useful thing, or no, I don't think it is.
I think that would be very useful, Paul. I mean, I would appreciate the signal. One unfortunate thing that has been happened is that there is not that much signal on cluster registry issues. It doesn't seem like people are paying a significant amount of attention to it.
And maybe this is one of the reasons. I'm just speculating. If people have to build one anyway to use cluster registry, then they probably wouldn't bother using cluster registry, and that's why you might not have a signal.
Yeah, that is a good point.
To be clear, I think the concept is extremely useful, but it has to be able to tell me where the clusters are and how to get into them. And it only tells me the first thing. And the how to get into it part, I kind of need another cluster registry to be able to figure that out.
Yeah, that has been a problem with the project from the beginning. I think the reason at least I shied away from that is because the way to make that work, that gets something out today, is to tell people to store secrets with credentials in their clusters, which isn't necessarily a good or a scalable solution for a general case. I think it's the sort of solution that works very well in a specific case when you understand your infrastructure, when you understand your setup. If you're willing to have potential users use the same set of credentials, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not something that I would want to recommend people to do, so I suppose there's just an unfortunate middle point where the solution that I would think is more of a secure, stable, generalizable solution doesn't really work yet.
Is that, are you thinking of secrets that are accessible to everyone? I mean, the model in my mind, and this is without having thought about it anywhere near as much as you, would be that each user would have their own secrets in their own namespace or wherever their secure place was, that would have references back to the cluster registry. And
So
then, yeah?
So you're saying that the cluster object or the cluster registry would not have references to those secrets. The users would store those secrets themselves and keep their own mapping back to the cluster registry.
Well, it seems to me that you have a one-to-many relationship. So you have one cluster with many credentials for different users, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the normal way to store any one-to-many relationship is with a back reference, not a forward reference, if that makes sense. Otherwise, you'd have to have, this never-ending list of references in your cluster object to every possible credential that could be used against that cluster, which is not how you would design a database or any other data structure. So the other way seems intuitively sensible to me. And maybe that solves your problem, which is that, all of those things could be in different places. They could be in different namespaces and have different RBAC rules on them, etc. And the user would go and get their secrets from wherever their place was, and all the ones that had references back to the cluster registry would be useful. Just off the top of my head thought.
Yeah, I guess the only thing is you wouldn't necessarily have a canonical way of getting those secrets. It would have to be like application specific. And then it would have a pointer back to the cluster, as opposed to, I want this cluster, I don't know how to authenticate to it, but it has a canonical way of providing that information to me, and then you can go about your business.
Well,
but I get your point. I get your point. I do see how the back reference is technically the way we should do it.
Well, one way to, so the one problem with what I suggested was that the secrets themselves, one, they don't typically have a back reference in them at the moment because they're standalone secrets. And secondly, where would you go and find them? Which namespaces should you look in and all that kind of stuff. So, you could fix that problem with something like a config map, which may be globally visible, or there could be a well-defined place where these config maps sit and they have references to the clusters and the credential provider. And then, obviously, if you didn't have access to the credential provider, you wouldn't be able to get the credentials. And the credential provider could be, either secrets in someone's namespace or an external LDAP server or whatever mechanism. And each config map could refer to, different external credential providers. I apologize for chiming in from the side because I haven't been involved in these discussions, but it doesn't seem like a terribly difficult thing.
Yeah, at one point there was also interest in the API machinery folks, I believe, wanting to adopt the API endpoint piece of the cluster itself. And it sounds like what I'm hearing is that we really need an API endpoint as part of the cluster. And we sort of need this other piece, right, that has some sort of metadata, potentially with some auth info, or metadata on where to get that auth info. So it's almost like we need a larger like cluster registry resource that actually maps to clusters and auth info information, whether that's cluster connection or something else. But we can probably all agree that the API endpoint piece is definitely a useful piece to have just in cluster alone, and potentially gets adopted in a more global Kubernetes way, such as in API machinery.
Yeah, I think it only, based on, just to repeat my previous statement, it only seems useful if you have another thing to do the authentication credential part. And that other thing looks very much like a cluster registry. So I sort of still stand by the argument that a cluster registry that only has API endpoints in it is not useful. Simply because you have to build another cluster registry that has references to those and all the other stuff. In which case you don't need the cluster registry.
Yeah. Yeah, it almost seems like a higher level sort of like registry concept that contains within it, you know, cluster and auth info information. And that registry could be like a multi-cluster registry sort of thing. And you have individual clusters with secrets and config map to reference those particular clusters.
Yeah. Anyway, leave it up to you guys to see whether that's worth doing. Was there anything else on the agenda today?
Yeah, that's all that's on the agenda for today.
Okay.
Cool.
All right.
Thanks for the discussion. That was really interesting.
No problem. See everybody later on.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.